Thank you to the Unione Buddhista Italiano. Very honored to be here with you today. When I think about the face of Buddhism today, I think of four related topics that I want to share with you in our time together. And first, however, I'd like to take a moment to look at the big picture, the larger sphere in which we are conducting this discussion. And then I'll consider how each of these relate to my four topics. I'm not showing the slides yet, please. I'll show a few at the end, if that's all right. Thank you. Wholeness, I'll be suggesting, is a big theme throughout the Buddhist traditions. Scientists and mystics, modern scientists, ancient mystics, all say that everyone and everything is connected. We are all born from space, children of the Big Bang, and everything we see and touch comes from space. How do we become so estranged from this world which itself births us? Our blood carries iron, sourced in the explosive energy of supernovas. We are not a smallness separate from this grandeur. We are part of it, nourished by it, contributing to it. My breath, my iron has been in someone else's body and will be again. Within this vast perspective, who among us is a stranger? How do we become so divided from each other? This wholeness and these connections are central to our existence, but we rarely live as if they were. Our unwieldy sense of separateness is the source of suffering. The suffering, the causes of suffering fundamentally have to do, as we know, with dividing everything into me and you, self and other, and all suffering and all negativity flows from that. We know that this is what the Dharma teaches. How to repair this separateness is the main lesson we humans need to learn. We feel separate from others, from society, from our own greatest potential, from our own feelings, and from an inchoate yet deeply intuitive yearning for the wholeness of our being. At their best, our spiritual, political, social, religious, and psychological systems are attempts to address this very thing. Separateness is suffering. Separateness, I want to say, is not the same as difference or simple disagreement. Modern culture is painfully aware of the longings to heal our brokenness, the horrific behavior of despots and those who serve them, of nations, peoples, races, religious standard bearers, using their power to hate and harm, failing to see that the situation holds so much more possibility than this stance of separateness will ever allow. So that's in the background of our conversation today, and in much of modern times as we meet Asian Buddhism, ancient and Asian Buddhism on Western ground. So with that in mind, I want to say a little bit about my own background and training in Buddhism, because this is what I bring to this conversation. And then I want to touch on four things. I want to touch on the way in which individuality, which is a particular type of separateness, inflects modern Western culture. And second, how that relates to how we learn about Buddhism and how we practice Buddhism, how we relate, for example, to ritual. And then I want to turn to some Buddhist sources, particularly Longchen Rebchen, the great architect of Dzogchen in Tibet, 14th century, and also some contemporary scholarship in microphenomenology to look at the importance in Buddhism and in life for first-person discourse, first-person experience, recognizing what that is and how that emerges in Buddhist thought and Buddhist practice. And finally, touch on the ineffability of it all, the sense of wonder that seems to inhabit the minds and hearts of the great practitioners of the past. So very briefly, my own background is I was fortunate to be able to study with many really extraordinary Tibetan teachers who were scholars, who were meditators. I first met Buddhism in the University of Wisconsin, which was the first Buddhist studies program in the United States. Got my first degree in Buddhism there, MA in Buddhist studies. And Khyentse Ngawang Lakden, who was the last abbot of Gyume Tantric College in Lower Lhasa, one of the great institutions of learning in Tibet, came there my second year. And so I was able to begin to learn Tibetan in order to study with him. He was a great soul, a great personality. He was born in 1900. He was 70 years old when I was first in grad school. So he really carried with him, just in his body, the ancient traditions of Tibet. He was delightful. He was someone who I was told if you saw him in Tibet from yards away, you would throw yourself on the ground because you could not look such an exalted person in the face. But we lived in a farmhouse outside Madison, Wisconsin, with graduate students. Jeffrey Hopkins, who translated for him, one of the few Westerners who knew Tibetan at that time. And he would pick up lint in the living room because we weren't keeping such a neat house. In other words, one of the most deeply respected figures in the Tibetan hierarchy was very humble, very modest, very good humored. He began teaching Buddhist Siddhanta, Trungta, at the University of Wisconsin. He taught from Kunchen Wangwo, Chaman Sheba, really difficult texts, which just flowed through him with ease. And then on weekends, he taught for the general public, as well as any graduate students who were interested. Faculty too came, a meditation. So from the very beginning for me, my training in Buddhism had the contemplative side and the scholarly side, which in fact go hand in hand together. Unlike in certain areas of modernity, the scholarly, the contemplative seem to be worlds apart. And this is something that we consider quite deeply in academia also, recognizing that the contemplative tradition has its own intelligence and is a very significant part, obviously, of the Buddhist tradition. So he modeled that for me. And also he modeled the way that one approaches texts in traditional Buddhist context, in a Tibetan context, and also in more, in any, I believe, traditional Buddhist context. You're never just handed, first of all, there weren't very many books. You don't just get handed a book like we do today and go home and read it and make what you will of it. The unit is an educated preceptor cum text. It's part, the text is embedded in an oral tradition. I think this is something important for us to understand as we come to Buddhism in modernity. I know many people who they refer to themselves as book Buddhists. They're not interested really in meeting a teacher. They're not interested in some cases in having friends, a sangha, or a community. They like to read books or podcasts, Headspace, very popular. And it does benefit them. It's a very different situation. Reading yourself or listening to a podcast, inside your earbud universe is a solitary activity. Engaging with a text with a teacher who has studied it for a lifetime and who holds also the oral scholarly tradition, which is very significant in Tibet. The oral tradition, the scholarly oral tradition, also the oral tradition of contemplative instruction is very well developed and is part of the whole process of learning about Buddhism. It's a social process, in short, not always so in the West. And this is one kind of difference. Later on, graduate school, University of Virginia, we were able, Jeffrey Hopkins again was able to invite many luminous scholars from India, from Dharamsala, and they also modeled this same kind of ease with rigorous scholarship, humility, good humor, and also a something different, I think, that we'll see when I talk in a bit about ritual. The ritual world and the academic world, for them, is really one world. And I found that very interesting. Lati Rinpoche, one of the great scholars of his generation, who, after the death of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's junior tutor, was promoted to that status. He came to the University of Virginia, and he had a bad cough. And one day he went into his room and he came out with a beautifully configured sculpture made out of dough, some kind of dough, the robes of a monk. And it was obviously part of his ritual. And he asked my then graduate school comrade, now well-known Professor Don Lopez, to take it out somewhere and put it in a hidden place. And for us students who knew him as a scholar, that was a teaching also. You know, he was at the height of rigorous academic accomplishment in his own context, and he created a statue, a figure for ritual purposes. And this is just true of Tibetan culture. So all of this has imprinted me quite a bit. Things that are somewhat antithetical in modern times, so integrated in the Tibetan context, I feel that's something important to remember as we, in our own context, move forward and engage with Buddhism. So one of the things that impacts us in modernity, not only in Western countries, but in places influenced by Western modernity, is the concept of individuality. We are individuals. And this is, to paraphrase Clifford Geertz, the great anthropologist, this is the idea of a person as a bounded, unique, and distinctive whole, which, like a shadow on grass, is set against and in contrast to other distinctive wholes. This seems normative in the West, at least in many places in the West, but as he points out, it's a rather peculiar idea in the larger understanding of world cultures. But whatever we grow up with, we feel is normal. And it seems to me that part of studying Buddhism in modern times is to recognize that what we grew up with is not normal. It's not the only way. Different cultures, particularly Asian cultures in the context of Buddhism, see things differently. And the point I'm trying to make in terms of brief vignettes from my own early days studying Buddhism is that communication with the host culture, the home culture of a Buddhist tradition that we are engaged in as scholars, as contemplatives, is important. I think it remains important. It would be wonderful if we were able to have Asian colleagues, for example, here at this conference, or perhaps at a future conference. I have gained so much from this kind of exchange, and in ways that can't really be captured only by saying they explained a text very well. So as part of that conversation then, I feel it's important to be aware of some of the different cultural assumptions that we hold without necessarily even knowing that we hold them. So this particular idea of an individual as, you know, a sort of bounded whole, in other words, separate from others, it wasn't always so. And very interesting that in the 15th century, the word indivisible was actually the meaning of individual, individuale in Old English pronunciation, I believe, like the individuale trinity, or a married couple were considered individual in a sense of not to be parted. The Trinity, inseparable, individual in the old sense. But at least since the 17th century, the term individual has emphasized the separateness of persons rather than their connection. This inversion of meaning carries centuries of history. What used to mean together now means apart. Numerous related terms also entered English language in this period. Self-sufficient, basically the late 16th and 17th century, words like self-sufficient, self-knowledge. Now, self-knowledge is very important. Swasamvedana is a very important term in Buddhism. It, however, has to do with recognizing oneself in certain ways in one's own experience. In other words, it's a kind of wholeness in a very intimate, personal way. Self-knowledge comes into the vocabulary along with words like self-made, self-seeker, selfish, self-interest, self-knowing, self-determination, self-conscious. These are all ways of separating oneself from one's environment, from part of one's experience. Self-conscious, I'm aware of how others are seeing my experience. I become a bit distanced from it myself, perhaps. There is we inhabit something different than the whole person perspective of earlier times in the West itself and that Buddhist culture carries. In modern culture, continuing with this idea of individuality, persons are groomed to be innovators, to make choices, to distinguish ourselves by the unique creative choices that we make. Creative genius is defined as a productive reaction against one's training. Be a rebel, do something new, don't go with the flow. This is quite different from creativity as it's framed in traditional Buddhist culture, where it's a way of nurturing, nourishing, bringing a fresh perspective on long-held principles more than a rebellion against them. In traditional times, East and West, humans were not the creator. The word create stems from the Latin creare, as I'm sure you know, to make or produce, and it used to refer only to what had been created by God. For St. Augustine, humans could not create. We are the created. And this perspective remains key until the 16th century, when the great Italian Torquato Tasso, poet, said there are two creators, God and the poet. So slowly the arts and then the religious arts come to be understood as possible human creation. Creativity in print, books, the rise of print culture now also supports a kind of separateness. As I said, reading books can be a very private affair. Individually, the move from the oral to literary context made it seem, Charles Taylor observes, that thought itself is localized. It made sense. It's starting to make sense at this time that thought occurs in the body and not outside it. And then more and more until today, not just in the body in general, but in the brain. Although most innovatively now also in the vagus nerve. But that's a very powerful notion in the West, that the mind is in the brain. And of course, as we know, in Asian cultures and Buddhist cultures, the heart mind, that's where we feel. That's where we have very strong feelings, but those feelings are not rational, and the brain is privileged in many cultural contexts in the West. So that's a different aspect than, as I mentioned, is modeled by many Buddhist unically trained Buddhists. So being aware of this means that we can become conscious that we need to make some kind of intelligent gestures to connect with people, not just people who look just like us, to have an inclusive attitude, This is a modern perspective, a modern concern in Buddhist communities, certainly in North America, that I'm aware of. I'm less aware of how this is impacting Europe. But I can tell you it's a very significant movement, and it is a modern perspective on how to heal one kind of separateness between races, between economic classes, through including everyone in Buddhist community. And that's taking a lot of effort, a lot of interest is going into that. Just a last observation, kind of an appreciation of how things have changed. When I first met Tibetan teachers, well, I had to learn Tibetan. I'm no natural linguist because none of them spoke English. And there were no books to read in English at that time, virtually none. This has changed. And my own teachers with whom I studied so much and published books with sometimes their names on the cover because I'm translating Tibetan texts with oral commentary. They could never read what I wrote. It was a very private situation. We talked and I published, but now we have from all countries, Buddhist adepts trained traditionally who also get university degrees and who can speak and join the conversation between modernity and Buddhism from their own side, from their own traditional cultural home base, so to speak. So again, very important that we include these colleagues, these friends, these teachers in our conversations. So with this background in mind, I want to say something about how these ideas of individuality impact our approach to ritual, and then go from there to self-observation and the importance of first-person skills. Ritual is central to Buddhist practice and rightly the object of a lot of scholarship. Its purpose is to bring one to awakening. Sometimes we're told we're already a Buddha, particularly in Mahayana, particularly in certain aspects of the Tibetan tradition. Well, what modern person can believe that with integrity, especially a modern scholar? Often there's resistance to ritual, and I think this is of two kinds. Does it work? Why? And I must say, I do think this varies a lot among Western cultures. I think this is probably less of an issue actually in Italy, also in South America. But it's an issue in North America and perhaps more so in Central Europe, this resistance to ritual. Resistance also to the idea of what ritual is trying to accomplish. Particularly in the Mahayana, particularly in the more esoteric traditions of the Mahayana, you are presumably practicing because you feel that you could become a Buddha, awakened, perfect. I did a little experiment with my rice class recently. They were new to Buddhism. And I asked them, and they agreed, if they would go into dyads and just take turns saying one to the other. I said, this might be awkward, but let's see what happens. You are perfect. Look into your classmates' eyes and say, you're perfect. One young woman said, there's no way she would say such a thing. She doesn't believe it. She can't believe it. And she was raised in a certain, rather, I think, strict form of Christianity, and that would be unacceptably prideful. She was unwilling even to think it. But she did agree to say it to her partner so that her partner could reflect on what they thought, what their reaction was. So a couple of the students said, actually, they found it very healing to have somebody look them in the eyes and say, you're perfect. Maybe they hadn't heard that very much, but they didn't resist it. I was interested to see. And then one student said, well, how could I be perfect? I can't get my papers in on time. And then I realized that this is a really big conversation. perfection, as the Buddhists are encouraging us to feel we can actually accomplish, is not about getting your papers in on time, of course. It's about some much larger picture, which we will approach in a moment. I must say that I found the discussion of Buddha nature and this claim that you are a Buddha, you can be a Buddha, your mind is empty after all, you are not really any of your afflictions. Okay, but then what am I? How could I be a Buddha? It didn't seem realistic. And I also couldn't drop it, you know. I keep chewing on it. And over some years, you know, the mind is described as that which is clear and knowing. That's a standard textbook definition. And on the Tibetan debating courtyard, based on Indian texts. And that seems true enough. Tulku Tunda, a well-known teacher, Tibetan teacher in the West, once said, you know, you may not believe that you could be a Buddha, but he said, what happens when you just let yourself be? You know, when you just sit, you're out looking at the beautiful mountains, for example, the Italian Alps, for example. Just feel good. His point, I believe, was that there's something naturally within us that knows how to some degree, to come to rest. And maybe that makes the idea of what ritual is trying to accomplish more realistic. But I think while modern Westerners in the last 50 years have grown more and more curious about Buddhist practice and scholarship, for many that both practice and scholarship often halts on the shores of ritual performance. Ritual seems in tension with our individuated urge for creativity and self-expression. Why should I do this, follow this text? I'm thinking very much of Tibetan sadhana, Tibetan practice where, you know, you recite, but all Buddhists recite and sit and breathe and chant. These are all rituals. As a modern person who's also quite immersed in Buddhist traditions, I have wondered how we might draw on our modernity while also coming to appreciate ritual engagement. And also to give up traditional ideas like karma. A surprising number of Western teachers of Buddhism don't teach karma. And some actually explicit, as you may know, say this, reject it, or at least don't entertain it as a serious matter. Maybe think of rebirth as a metaphor, which actually is helpful. It's helpful to think of it that way. But what is lost when that isn't even part of the conversation? Karma. That means there's no interest in reflecting on the concept of rebirth, which is kind of central to Buddhist traditions. I think at least one has to acknowledge if one is going to drop it out. Ladi Rinpoche, who I mentioned earlier, who arrived in the University of Virginia knowing nothing of the West, he might as well have been out of the 14th century, lived in Dharamsala near the Dalai Lama's compound. And one day to practice my Tibetan, and I said, well, you know, Christianity, they believe that after death you go to heaven or you go to hell. I didn't think I could talk about purgatory in my Tibetan. I left it at that. And his mouth dropped open. He was astounded. He said, what? You mean they believe in one rebirth and no more? That was a wake-up call for me. I thought I was open-minded. I was thinking about rebirth. I didn't know if I believed it or not, but I was thinking about it. And it, you know, it had never occurred to me that not believing it would be so strange to someone on the other side of the mirror. So about this resistance to ritual, such as it might exist, I want to say two things. I think it can be incorporated into practice, and also it's related to the business of repetition, which is also something that Westerners don't always like to do. And there are questions about other aspects of ritual. It involves bowing. Why should you bow? Don't like to bow. in the West, and due to very important, pungent historical circumstances, in certain contexts at Naropa University, Black students could not bow to white teachers. And they had very meaningful conversations about this. But bowing is not submission. Bowing is surrender, a very important distinction made by Immanuel Kant. And the logic of bowing is more poetic than rational. One bows not out of logic, but because one is moved. Michelangelo's Pietà, the Vatican, is Christian religious art, and yet it also expresses something of universal human appeal. Whether or not we believe literally in virgin birth, we can be touched by the tender love of Mother Mary for her child. So I've practiced Tibetan Buddhism for over 4 decades now, and still resistance arises in me, no matter how much love and familiarity I have with Tibetan culture. You know, I'm a contemporary person, contemporary woman in the West. I do have resistance, and the simple fact of that, you know, we can't not be modern. But I do feel that resistance makes it possible to shine a light on what a particular ritual practice is actually doing for us, which is what is important to understand. And also, I think we may be challenged because we lack certain skills that traditional Buddhist culture, traditional cultures in general, assume, like that you're present in your body. This is not true. And it certainly wasn't true for me. For many academics, for many people in the West, you know, kind of one's in one's head. So it may be important to supplement one's training with less traditional emphases, for example, on being present to the body, being able to rest in your belly, which perhaps comes more naturally to someone who grows up climbing mountains. You have to be, you know, in your body. We can also, the body gives us a clue to how we feel. First of all, the body is always in the present. So when you touch into your breath, when your attention is with your breath or sensations in the body, as many meditations encourage, oh, you're in the present. It's a quick route to the present moment. Or taking refuge, very important ritual in Buddhism. We don't really do this out of logic. Taking refuge in Buddha or in green Tara. It's really not about what we think. Do we believe that she existed? What we believe becomes at that moment less important than what we feel, like looking at the Pietà, less important than what we feel. What we feel, we won't know what we feel without being present in the body. It's not all about ideas. Although the scholarly corpus of Buddhism, just of India and Tibet, let alone China, Japan, Korea, is huge. It's a huge scholarly endeavor. Again, the model of scholarship, mind and heart coming together. It takes time for ritual practice to become intimate, requires a lot of repetition. Interestingly, Kierkegaard said that it's only by revisiting again and again something that you be convinced that what you have known belongs to you. The Buddhist practice and really all of its scholarship and the traditional context is oriented toward us knowing something that we feel belongs to us, belongs to us. So this brings us to the business of first-person perspective, first-person introspection. I'm going to say something about how that is looked at in modernity, and then go to really the heart of the matter for Buddhism. Michelle Whitball, in articles, I'll show you at the end some of the references that I'm speaking from now, in case you'd like to pursue it further, which I highly recommend. Michelle Bitball and Claire Petit-Mangin have written about this, that there are kind of two ideas about first-person experience. A romantic idea that it's infallible, and the idea Descartes, Locke, Hume, Husserl even are argued for a certain kind of infallibility of personal self-reflection. On the other hand, rationally oriented figures and certain experiments say that it's useless. People are typically point to the wrong person when they, on the lineup, I saw this person commit a crime. We know that there is also fallacy there. So obviously it's a nuanced situation. A very famous experiment by Nisbet and Wilson in 1977 did a great deal to discredit the recent contemporary ideas about first-person perspective. Participants are shown two pictures of a young woman and asked which one is the most beautiful. The pictures are then hidden for 2 seconds, after which the participant is shown the picture of the woman not chosen and said, and asked, why did you choose this one? Astonishingly, 80% of the participants did not know that the pictures had been swapped. This was, for decades, regarded as pretty substantial proof that first-person observation is useless. But later research by Claire Petit-Mangin came to a different conclusion. She repeated the exact same experiment with one change. Between the time that the pictures were retrieved and swapped, the participant was asked, not looking at the pictures, but asked, why did you choose this one? And they were given time to reflect on that. In other words, they carefully reviewed their own first-person experience. This time, 80% recognized that the wrong picture was shown to them. This is quite significant. We tend not to pay attention to our first-person experience. We're busy with what's going in our heads. We might even confuse thinking with feeling. We may dismiss ideas that come to us in the ebb and flow of things. We may just reject an emergent idea. This turns out to be a very significant internal process that stops some of our own creativity, some of our own intuition. The body is very important here in being aware of our own experience. I'll just mention that again. The deep belly, Daniel Siegel, a famous scholar of body, mind, brain psychology. The deep belly is home to your gut, miles of intestinal corridors. And it now appears some neuroscientists are saying that information passes through that region. We call it gut feeling. Our gut feelings are not always accurate, but they sometimes do provide an important source of knowing. We bring in that wisdom up to our cortical consciousness. So he, at least Daniel Siegel and others, are now in a more modern way beginning to look at the confluence of heart-mind, which has always been present in traditional cultures, describing it as something like a parallel processing from the gut through the heart and the brain, with a lot of communication neuroscience is talking about now between the brain and the vagal nerve. It's much more complicated than just feeling that everything happens up here. So why is this relevant to us? One of my fields of great interest and study and translation work is the Exotian Traditions of Tibet, Nyingma Buddhist, as well as Unbounded Wholeness, a book I did with Geshe Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, who has many students in Europe. It's called Unbounded Wholeness, and it's a translation of an important Dzogchen text. Longchenpa says something very interesting. And as you may know, in the Nyingma, the ancient form of Tibetan Buddhism, there's a 9-path structure, 9 spiritual pathways, with Dzogchen, the great completeness, so wholeness, completeness, at the top. The third one is the third going up is the Bodhisattva path, and that's where Madhyamaka is taught. So in talking about the third vehicle, Madhyamaka, not yet Tantra, not yet Dzogchen, Longchenpa says some interesting things. He names Dharmadhatu, the source realm, we could say in English, or basic space, sometimes translated, as the ultimate truth, Paramartha Satya. The professor was speaking earlier about many traditions in India and Tibet, Nagarjuna. Starting with Nagarjuna, emptiness is the ultimate truth. Longchenpa says it's the Dharmadhatu. And the Dharmadhatu, once he talks about Dzogchen, has become central to his discussion. The Dharmadhatu is not something other than emptiness. It too is empty, but he uses emptiness as an epithet for the Dharmadhatu, the ultimate truth. It's the empty space of the Dharmadhatu in which all things arise. The Dharmadhatu is the home for everything. It's the womb of the world. It's the Buddha nature. It's the Buddha nature which, going back to our ideas of wholeness, includes everything within us, good, bad, it's all included. That's very important in Dzogchen. So Longchenpa, I find it interesting, is bringing this, he's like preparing for it in his discussion of Madhyamaka, just as Je Tsongkhapa prepares for his discussion of Tantra in Ngaram Chemo with his discussion of Madhyamaka. He explains emptiness brilliantly as ultimate truth and makes the point that that same emptiness is the emptiness of highest yoga Tantra. Okay, so ultimate truth is Dharmadhatu for him. Now, for Tsongkhapa, ultimate truth is emptiness, and emptiness is also the sthana, the neluk, the way things are. Longchenpa, already when he's talking about Madhyamaka, says that the way things are is wisdom. This is not, wisdom and the Dharmadhatu are not separate, especially when you get to Dzogchen, the Dharmadhatu is suffused with wisdom. So they're not separate. But in saying that primordial wisdom is the way things are, what is very important, and I don't think you would understand this just from reading the text, but looking at it experientially, it makes tremendous sense. To say that everything is the nature of wisdom, right away I'm thinking, what do you mean? My cell phone is the nature of wisdom? But he's not making an objective statement. That's very important to understand. He's saying that when I look at my cell phone, and now when you look at it, what is occurring? It's appearing in the field, the Dharmadhatu field of your experience. So let's take a moment on this. Maybe you'd like to take your eyes off the screen for a moment and look at something in your room. A clock, a picture, a book, just something, one thing. So you're looking at it, right? I can't see your faces. I trust that you're looking at it. Can you separate? You're looking, you're aware of your looking, you're knowing, recognize it, see it, and you're aware of the thing you're looking at. Can you separate that thing from your knowing of it? Can you pull apart your knowing from the thing known? This is worth a lot of pondering. But you can't, can you? In that sense, the nature, the way that thing is wisdom. Just like a moon reflected in water, there's no moon there. There's nothing but water there. The way the moon is, so to speak, its way of being is that it's water. So in this way, whatever we're seeing hearing, sensing, touching, it's all in the field of your experience. It is resting in the home ground of your experience, just as a reflection rests on its home ground of water or a mirror. It's not an objective, scientific, third-person statement. It's a description of first-person experience. When we see, this is what occurs. Now, for neuroscience, in the Mind and Life, very interesting discussions on such matters, neuroscience has long called this the problem of consciousness. You can't separate, you can't just look at a thing without consciousness. And consciousness is always part of the scene of something else. Michelle Bitball has written about this very beautifully, Science as It Could Have Been. It's one of the books on the list that I'll show you shortly. But for Dzogchen, and also in the Bahia Sutra, early Buddhist sutras, we are finding there are similar descriptions. There's only seeing and the seen. There's no you. The point is, there's no you who is the seer outside the process of seeing and seeing. In Dzogchen, it's expressed in this way. I think a very similar idea. It's expressed that everything is actually the way it is. It has the nature of consciousness. So this is not a problem for Dzogchen. It's pointing to some of the very special features of consciousness, of knowing, that knowing has an intimate connection with us. We are not individuality. We're not separate from our knowing. We are not. So that means that all the people that we see, the ones we like, the ones that we don't like, they're all reflections in our mirror. And possibly, if with our modern sensibilities regarding the perniciousness of racial prejudice, war that comes out of this hatred, we can make it a purpose. It's, I think, good meeting place between modernity and Buddhism, make it a purpose. So when I start to recognize, as I do in my practice, that everything is, if thoughts are the fish, are like fish in my pond, I can try to be the pond rather than fish. And everybody's in my pond, actually. Everything that I know is reflected in my pond. And so I have an intimate connection with everything. And perhaps I can use this, perhaps Buddhist communities can use this as an orientation toward peace. There is engaged Buddhism already, which is extraordinary. And it may also be possible to use some of these very subtle insights from the Buddhist tradition to open to a path that we need in this perilous time. Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, in a book called The Vajra Heart Revisited, to divide, speaks to this also, to divide appearance, to feel that objects are over there and I am here, to feel that you are on the other shore and I am here and there's a chasm between, that's becoming an individual. That's the divide. That's the separateness on which all other, desire, hatred, pride, jealousy, all are based on that ignorance, as we know from the Buddhist tradition. So we practice recognizing that everyone and everything that we see is a part of our experience. And that Longchenpa also says that wisdom abides in the body. So waking up wisdom is also waking up the sensibility of one's own embodiment. Again, moving against long-held Western divisions between mind and body. Nowadays, I think in the West, that's also being challenged. Okay, and then moving toward closing, one or two things I would like to say. I'm going to end up, for the sake of time, unless it comes up in the questions. So Claire Petit-Margin and Michelle Bitball, in talking about what they're called microphenomenology, are talking about the importance and possibility of accessing first-person perspective. That's why Claire Petit-Margin did this experiment to undo the Nesbitt-Wilson conviction that first-person understanding could never be valuable and never be correct. And microphenomenology is a way of recognizing experience when it happens. And it turns out that she studied intuition. That's also on the slide. The title of the piece is on the slide. You'll see, very interesting. I just mentioned one finding. They studied not what people, the intuitive ideas that arose, but the experience of intuition. And they studied it by going back to asking people, or sometimes people like Einstein wrote about what happened just before this, E equals mc squared dawned for Einstein. What happened just before the perfect word for your poem or article just arose for you? We all have these experiences. The research shows, in brief, that it was a moment when you were quite relaxed in body and mind. You weren't thinking about that thing at all. You weren't worrying about it. You weren't making effort. You were relaxed. And in that state of realization, many people also describe a softening of the boundary between self and other, between self and world. You become more, maybe holistically part of the world around you, not cut off like a silhouette in the manner I described earlier. There's a sense of porousness. There's a sense that it is coming. The language used, when people describe this, she points out, is like, it came to me. Not like I got this idea, but it arose. There's something natural about it. Now, I'm not saying that this is the same thing as experiencing the wisdom that Longchenpa or Tsongkhapa is talking about when they describe the higher reaches of Buddhist practice, but I do think it's a very compelling analogy, and it resonates with what I said earlier about Tukutunda, that if most of us, most of the time, hopefully, if we allow ourselves to relax, we're in a different state. We see that there's a certain kind of openness, a less bounded state, maybe not completely non-dualistic, but less two-ish, not so much two, a less bounded state that we participate just naturally in a larger wholeness. And what does that feel like? Apparently, this kind of recognition or realization, or even just liking it or reading the poetry around it, for example, Longchenpa's poetry, it's marvelous. It feels magical. There's a sense of wonder. Longchenpa often exclaims with wonder about things. How is it when there's actually nothing really there? Everybody is so convinced, in the reified reality, concreteness of everything. Says how marvelous. This is marvelous and superb. The secret of all the perfect Buddhas, he says, is that all things are born within what is unborn. And yet, in the very act of their being born, there is no birth. What can this mean? Well, one thing it can mean is that nothing ever newly arises and departs from your sphere of experience, your reality. All has the nature of wisdom. Ideas that come are here. Fears that come are here. There's nowhere else to go. And this is actually a big point that Longchenpa makes in one of his most stellar Dzogchen works, the Chunying-Tzu, the precious treatise on the Dharma Dhatu, or the precious treasury of basic space. It's been translated into English. And there's something so dissolving of a sense of alienation in recognizing that. Everything is, fish in our pond, clouds in our sky. We are the creators of the world that we see. And this is an aspect of wonder. It's a state of enjoyable, in a state of relaxation. It's fun. And interestingly enough, it bears much analogical similarity to states well known to us like intuition. Oh, just had an idea. What happened? You can try it yourself next time something just arises for you. What was I doing right before that? I'm guessing you weren't worrying about the thing you were trying to figure out. And that also suggests that, sometimes I feel that as a modern person, it's helpful to find these correlates in ordinary human experience. Because if Buddhist traditions are going to ask us to believe that we can become liberated, that we can become awakened, it's going to be important for us to see that we already have experiences that are rather in the similar ballpark. As one of my teachers says, Buddha doesn't tell us what we're not. Buddha is here to show us who we are, what we are, this Buddha nature, which is actually the home ground of everything. Otherwise, maybe particularly this is true of the Tibetan traditions, it gets exotified and then becomes very other. And I personally feel that as scholars and or contemplatives ourselves, it's important to bring these home, to become, as Kierkegaard said, to feel that this is something that we can know. That's hopeful. And I want to close with that hopefulness as one of the areas of a confluence, creative confluence, I think, between Buddhism and modernity, and show you with the help of your wonderful staff who have been so kind. Thank you, organizers. You've just been a pleasure to work with. And Chiara, if I may mention you specifically with all our back and forth email, if you would show the slides to sum up where we've been. This is a poem that expresses something that's also in the All-Creating Majesty, the Gunche Gelbo. This is a classic Dzogchen statement. In Dzogchen Tantras, reality itself speaks first person. Nothing, not even one thing, does not arise from me. Samantabhadra says that. Samantabhadra is our true nature, this tradition tells us. This is a Dzogchen perspective. We also, this is our creativity. Reality is fundamentally creative. Nothing, not even one thing, does not arise from me. Nothing, not even one thing, dwells not within me. Everything, just everything, emanates from me. Thus, I am only one. Knowing me is knowing all. Great bliss. It's because there are many that there can be one. This is also a Dzogchen saying, and that is blissful. And we have an image here of the union of male and female aspects of reality, reminding us that also more and more, there's a focus certainly in the West, of inclusivity of men, women, all gender, everything, everyone on the spectrum, trans, gay, bi, everyone included in this marvelous creativity. Okay, the next slide, please. I'm starting to think of this as a theme song. This is a quote. Longchenpa quotes it from, it's a similar, from the All Creating Majesty, an early Dzogchen Tantra. And I translated it because the oral culture is so important. I try, when I can, to translate things into chantable English that are usually 7 or 9 syllables so that they can be chanted according to a traditional Tibetan melody. So our practice texts, if they're in chantable English, we can chant them. And one of my teachers said the blessings, the waves of grace come in more easily. We all know that singing, especially in Italy, singing is a different state. So this is Richard Barron's translation. He's a wonderful translator and gave me a leg up to try to do this chantable version. Because you feel differently about what you sing. Body is different, mind is different. Nothing hinders waking more than remaining unaware of what is already there, right there without fuss or strain. Buddha nature is already there. I've had teachers who will just turn around and ask you, do you believe you can become a Buddha? And that's quite a question. Thank you. Next slide, please. Is it there? Yes, I'm at the conclusion. Oh, this is in case you want to take a picture of it. I wrote this earlier. I read this earlier. How marvelous. The secret of all the perfect Buddhas, things are born within what is unborn. And then the next slide is the texts that you might be interested in. And if you can take a snapshot of it, it's maybe too small to read here. Thank you so much. Thank you for this opportunity. And